The
Excellent. And
broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Uh-oh. All right, good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, depending on where in the country you are joining us from. My name is Wendy Wilkes, and I'm the Manager of Regulatory and Legislative Affairs with the Association of State Drinking Water Administrators, or ASDWA. Thanks, everybody, for joining us on this Friday afternoon for a webinar on the Toxic Substance Control Act, or TSCA, as we fondly refer to it. I do have a few introductory and housekeeping slides here before we get started. So I know we mostly have state staff on the call today, but I did spy a few folks from utilities and engineering firms, and we're so glad that you could join us today. So for the uninitiated, a quick background on ASDWA. Our mission is to provide information, opportunities, and guidance to state and federal leaders, as well as partners in the drinking water sector, to protect public health and the environment. And our members are the Drinking Water Program Administrators from the 50 states, the 5 territories, the Navajo Nation, and the District of Columbia, who provide public water system oversight through regulation, technical assistance, and funding. So today's webinar is really exciting because it's definitely outside of the traditional boundaries that our members tend to work in. So hopefully, as you know, this webinar is the first in a 3-webinar series on TSCA. And this webinar is meant to provide an overview of the Act with a focus on provisions of interest to drinking water administrators and really the water sector at large. The report listed there in the 4th bullet, last year's ASDWA project on contaminants of emerging concern, was really the catalyst for this webinar series. As we were digging into the contaminant life cycle and how we could manage contaminants of concern that we find in drinking water, TSCA kept coming up as one of the regulatory gatekeepers for, chemical contaminants. But we found that many ASDWA members and their staffs weren't as familiar with TSCA and its many intricacies. So we initiated this webinar series to provide that opportunity to learn a bit more about it. And here you'll see the list of the scheduled webinars. The next one will be held on August 26th, same time, 1 to 2:30 p.m. Eastern, and we're going to have speakers from EDF and Earth Justice walk us through some of the key links between TSCA and environmental health, of course with an eye to drinking water issues. So let me go ahead and introduce today's speakers. We have 2 really wonderful presenters here with us today from the Environmental Protection Agency's Office of Pollution Prevention and Toxics. So Ryan Schmidt is a special assistant to the director and deputy directors in EPA's OPPT, and he works with all things TSCA. He's held various positions in the agency focusing on TSCA policy and implementation since about 2010. Including providing technical assistance during the TSCA reform efforts in 2015 and 2016, and previously held detail assignments to both the U.S. House of Representatives Energy and Commerce Committee, the Department of Justice, Environment and Natural Resources Division. And I love this fun fact that Ryan provided. He said he was once his own drinking water administrator of sorts during his 4-month through hike of the Appalachian Trail. So very cool, Ryan. Happy to have you. And we also have Susanna Blair with us today, who's a special assistant to the office director and deputy director for OPPT at EPA. Susanna was the lead on a rulemaking required under TSCA, which instructs the agency on how to conduct chemical risk evaluations to determine if a chemical is at risk to human health or the environment. She also works on TSCA projects, including chemical prioritization, existing chemical risk evaluations, and risk management rulemakings. Before she was at OPPT, Susanna worked in EPA's Office of Research and Development. And in 2014, Dr. Blair was an AAAS Congressional Science Fellow working as a staffer for a senator on the Environment and Public Works Committee. and Susanna holds both doctorate and master's degrees in geological sciences from the University of Florida and a Bachelor of Arts from Colgate University. And Susanna has 2 small kids with her at home, so the last few months have been quite the whirlwind, I'm sure. So thank you guys both for joining us today. We do have plans to reserve some time at the end of the webinar for any questions that might come up throughout the presentation that you might have. So please type your questions into the box on your webinar control panel. There's no need to wait to send them in until the end of the webinar. I'll go ahead and collect those questions throughout the hour and a half and pose those to Ryan and Susanna at the conclusion of the presentations. And as a reminder, now is a great time to close other programs like your Outlook or email and Messenger applications to reduce any buffering and make sure we have a quality experience. These are wild times and we know people are juggling all sorts of stuff at home. So if you have to miss part of the webinar today, do not worry. We are recording this webinar and it'll be made available on ASDWA's website, probably sometime next week. And you'll be able to find the recording under the Events tab if you choose webinar recordings. Okay, so with that, we are on to the main event. I will go ahead and turn this over to Susanna and Ryan.
Great, thank you, Wendy. This is Ryan, and I'll take it over here while we're getting the slides situated. But appreciate those introductions and for the opportunity to speak to this group today. As Wendy mentioned, both Dr. Blair and I work in EPA's Office of Pollution Prevention and Toxics, which is the office with primary responsibility to implement the Toxic Substances Control Act, or TSCA. So we live and breathe TSCA and TSCA implementation every day, and we appreciate all the folks on the line taking an interest in learning more. So with that, on to slide 2. Just a quick preview here of what we'll cover today. I'll start things off with a little bit of TSCA history, some of the shortcomings of the original law, and the TSCA reform efforts that culminated in the new law that we have today. And I'll turn things over to Dr. Blair. She'll cover some of the key components of our existing chemicals program, including the major changes from the 2016 amendments, such as the new prioritization process, requirements for risk evaluations, and some considerations for risk management actions. Then I'll give a quick overview of our new chemicals program, and finally cover some of the new requirements related to claiming confidential information and the new opportunities for EPA to share that information with states and other parties under certain circumstances. Slide 3. TSCA was originally signed into law more than 40 years ago in 1976. And one of the first things that was required in that law was for EPA to establish an inventory of chemical substances that were in existence at that time. That became known as the TSCA inventory. And there were over 62,000 chemicals listed on that first inventory. And at a very high level, the authorities and requirements in TSCA are divided between existing chemicals, those that were on that TSCA inventory, and new chemicals, those that were not. Any new chemical substance was subject to pre-manufacturer reporting requirements under Section 5 of that law and a 90-day review by EPA. For existing chemicals, EPA had the authority, but not a mandate, to review and regulate risks under Section 6 of the law. And importantly, in order to take action on those chemicals, EPA had to identify unreasonable risks, a standard which, under the original law, required a balancing of the risks of the chemical to human health and environment against the costs of taking action to mitigate those risks. In the late 1980s, EPA promulgated a rule many of you may be familiar with under TSCA Section 6 to ban and phase out uses of asbestos. That rule took years to develop. It was supported by thousands and thousands of pages of administrative record, but ultimately the rule was challenged. And in 1991, the court overturned it in large part on the grounds that EPA had not met its standard under TSCA. That decision set the precedent for an extremely high bar to take any regulatory action under TSCA Section 6, and effectively resulted in EPA ceasing to exercise its TSCA Section 6 authorities on existing chemicals for the next 30 or so years. Over the years, where EPA or other federal agencies did not act on chemical risks, states have played an important role to fill in those regulatory gaps, resulting in what some have characterized as a patchwork of state regulations on chemicals. On to the next slide, please. All of this led to a lengthy legislative effort to reform TSCA, both to fix some of those fundamental flaws that I described and to ensure that chemicals were held to a consistent national standard. The efforts culminated in 2016 with the Frank R. Lautenberg Chemical Safety for the 21st Century Act, which was named for the late Senator Lautenberg, who was an early champion of TSCA reform. The amendments are comprehensive in nature and fundamentally changed many parts of the TSCA program, which we'll talk about in the coming slides. The law was signed on June 22nd, 2016, and it was effective immediately. We've been off and running ever since, just passing the four-year anniversary last month. Just a few points about the significance of the amendments. It was the first major update to TSCA in 40 years, and described by some as the most significant piece of environmental legislation in the last 25 years. It was also passed with overwhelming bipartisan support in both the U.S. House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate, and received a broad range of support from stakeholders in the chemical industry, downstream users of chemicals, NGOs from the public health and environmental communities, and others. And with that, I'll turn things over to Dr. Blair to get into some of the details of our existing chemicals program.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Again, Susanna Blair, and I'm going to spend the majority of my time with you today talking about our existing chemicals program. So as Ryan described, we have a new chemicals and an existing chemicals program. Existing chemicals are those that are already in the marketplace. New chemicals are those for which manufacturers are submitting requests to bring a new chemical to the marketplace. And as Ryan so nicely described, prior to the 2016 amendments, EPA did not have a mandate to review any chemicals in the marketplace. We did assessments, risk assessments on chemicals, and attempted and did propose some regulation on these existing chemicals, but as you just heard, it was not the most effective way to regulate chemicals in the U.S. So what the amendments brought with it were pretty significant changes to our existing chemicals program. First of all, we now have the mandate to evaluate them. We have clear and enforceable deadlines, and all of this is described in the statute, and we have done this through rulemaking over the past few years. We now must assess chemicals with a risk-based standard. So this is looking at both the chemical hazard or the health effect to both humans and the environment, but also thinking about the exposure of that chemical. And so risk is hazard and exposure. We cannot consider the costs or other non-risk factors associated with a chemical during the chemical assessment. There are certain chemicals for which are classified as persistent, bioaccumulative, and toxic chemicals identified on the 2014 update to the TSCA work plan. So this is a list of chemicals which prior to the Lautenberg amendments, EPA had identified as potential bad actors, to say it one way. And under the 2016 amendments, we have a mandate to fast track a number of these chemicals, which we call PBT chemicals. Under the amendments, we must consider risk to potentially exposed or susceptible subpopulations. This phrase is defined in the statute, but it's those populations that may be more exposed or more susceptible, specifically calling out workers, children, pregnant women. And so there's a mandate to look at these specific populations. We are required to address any unreasonable risks that we identify in these risk evaluations, moving chemicals directly from evaluation to risk management. And now we have also expanded authority to require the development of additional chemical information by manufacturers. And so the law gave us pretty wide-ranging both requirements and regulatory capability to look at these chemicals and then to address any risk that we may find. We did this through what we termed the framework rules. So that these are the procedures which we are implementing and aligning EPA's chemical management program with the new requirements. And there are 4 of these rules that fall under these framework rules, and I'm going to skip the first one. That's definitely a webinar for another time, the fees rule. And so under the statute, we have expanded authority to collect fees from manufacturers. So we're not going to talk about that today, but I just want to acknowledge it. But the 3 that really form the basis of our existing chemicals program are first, the active and inactive inventory reporting rule, the prioritization rule, and the risk evaluation rule. All 3 of the rules that I'm going to focus on were required to be finalized within a year after TSCA's passage. And so, as Ryan said, we really did have to hit the ground running when it came to implementing TSCAs. We had no time to really ramp up, get our ducks in a row. We had to start immediately, and part of that was the process of proposing and then finalizing these rules. So the first one is the TSCA inventory for active and inactive chemicals. As Ryan described, some 62,000 chemicals in the marketplace from 1976. And what EPA did not have a good handle on was of those which are active and which are no longer active in commerce. And so what this rule did was it required manufacturers to report if they have manufactured a chemical in the past 10 years. And this reporting ended in October of 2018. And as of August of 2019, manufacturers and processors are required to notify the EPA before if they reintroducing an inactive chemical substance. And so what this does is gives us an accurate count of the number of existing chemicals in the marketplace. And right now we have about 40,000 substances. This inventory is on our website. It is searchable by both chemical name or CAS number. Some are CBI or confidential business information, but you can go in and look at the range of chemicals that are active in the inventory. What this also does is create the pool from which we are drawing chemicals to begin the risk assessment or the risk evaluation process. So this figure is the 30,000-foot view of our existing chemicals program, kind of like the pipeline through which chemicals move through both prioritization or through prioritization, risk evaluation, and then on to risk management. And so if you're looking at your screen, maybe off to the left beyond the screen is this pool of 40,000 plus chemicals. And this is the pool with which we would draw, sometimes just one by one, into the prioritization process, through the risk evaluation process, and then on to risk management if necessary. So we're going to start with prioritization. Prioritization is a 9 to 12 month process, which we take a chemical and screen it for a varying number of hazard, exposure, its presence in what types of products. And at the end of this 9 to 12 month process, a chemical is designated as either high priority for risk evaluation or low priority. Those that are high priority move directly into risk evaluation. During this process, it's a 3 to 3.5 year process. EPA evaluates the risk, looking at, as I said, both hazard and exposure of this chemical. And this culminates in either a finding of unreasonable risk or a finding of no unreasonable risk. If unreasonable risk is found, these conditions under which the risk is found move directly into risk management, and we must eliminate the unreasonable risk within 2 to 4 years. So this is the pipeline set up by those framework rules. which allows us to evaluate the chemicals in the marketplace. So I want to talk a little bit more about prioritization. So again, that first box to the left. So this is our risk-based screening process and criteria for designating those chemicals as either a high priority substance or a low priority substance. This process must take 9 to 12 months, no less than 9 months, no more than 12 months. It includes 2 public comment periods where we look for the public to provide any additional information that may be useful as we look to these chemicals. There is a preference for chemicals on the 2014 update to the TSCA work plan. These again are those chemicals for which EPA identified in prior to the Lautenberg amendments that may be potential for adverse hazard and possible exposure. And they are screened against various criteria. These include hazard, exposure, persistence, bioaccumulation, toxicity, cancer, also if they are present in products that children use. And so in looking at these chemicals within this 9 to 12 month period, what we have to determine is if they're high priority for risk evaluation or a low priority substance. I don't like particularly reading words on the slide, but I think the definitions as provided under TSCA are pretty important here. So a high priority substance is one that may present an unreasonable risk of injury to health or the environment because of a potential hazard and a potential route of exposure under the conditions of use, including any risk to potentially exposed or susceptible subpopulations without considerations of costs or other non-risk factors. And so I want to draw your attention to some of the language here. A chemical may present a potential of hazard or a potential route of exposure. And so the bar for identifying these high priority chemicals is actually fairly low. And a low priority substance, in turn, is one that does not meet the standard of high priority. And so a low priority substance isn't one for which there is little or no risk or low risk. It is just that it is low priority for risk evaluation. There's one other criteria which I think would be of interest to this group, is that in screening chemicals in this prioritization process, one of the criteria for which we have to screen is whether the substance is if the substance storage is near a significant source of drinking water. And this criteria came about in response to the Elk River spill in West Virginia in 2014. And I'm going to jump ahead a little bit because I think it's important for you to hear how we looked at this criteria. We looked at it for both storage near surface and underground sources of drinking water. We first looked at if this chemical substance were released in a one-time high volume release or from a slower release over time, could it culminate with adverse effects? We looked at the chemical's potential for human health impacts or environmental impacts. We looked at the chemical characteristics of the substance to see how would it react upon being spilled into a body of water. And we chose this approach because there is not a great deal of data with respect to storage, and it's not tracked under TSCA, generally not available. We also looked to see if the chemical was on any list already regulated. Is it on the National Primary Drinking Water Regulation list? Is it regulated under the Clean Water Act? We also looked to see if it was listed on the Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act, looking at CERCLA or the Clean Air Act. And we determined that if it was on one of those lists, it was likely to present, had the potential to present some kind of risk if near sources of drinking water. So in thinking through this criteria, particularly for the low priority substances. Walking through each of these very carefully was a high priority for us, and making sure that it was in fact a low priority substance. So what we've done so far, I alluded to this, TSCA requires that we designated 20 high priority substances 3.5 years after the passage of the law. And so in December of last year, we identified 20 high priority substances for risk evaluation. In identifying those substances, we had to choose at least 50% from the 2014 update to the TSCA work plan. TSCA required us, the amendments required that. What we did consider was the sufficient quantity and quality of information. It's very challenging to conduct risk evaluations on chemicals where there's little or no information. And particularly for chemicals that fall under TSCA, this is unfortunately not uncommon. There is not a great deal of information about many of the chemicals that fall within TSCA's purview. We also looked at considerations for agency priorities. We talked to other program offices, the Office of Children's Health, the Office of Water, to survey for them what would be a chemical that they would be interested in seeing a TSCA risk evaluation. And so that we now have 20 substances that have completed the prioritization process and are now in the risk evaluation process. What we also did, required under TSCA, was designate 20 low priority substances. And so these again are substances that are not low risk or no risk, but are low priority for risk evaluation, and so didn't meet the standard of high priority. Again, that goes back to the potential hazard, potential exposure. We chose these chemicals from the Safer Chemical Ingredients List, or SCIL, which is a list from EPA for those chemicals that have been identified under the use as low risk to human health. So back to our pipeline here. Again, prioritization, we either end in high priority or low priority. Those high priority chemicals, for which we just finished 20, will move directly into risk evaluation. TSCA outlines many of the methods for which we have to conduct risk evaluation, but also our regulation that we passed in 2017. So I'm going to move into the risk evaluation of existing chemicals. There are a number of statutory requirements. Again, we had to establish by rule this process for risk evaluation. The purpose is to determine if a chemical presents an unreasonable risk of injury to health or the environment under the conditions of use. And this is a really important phrase. So it's not just looking at the chemical in a beaker on your desk. It's really looking at the chemical under which the uses are in commerce, which requires a great deal of work on our part to determine the range of uses. Some chemicals have upwards of 80 different uses. Some may only have a handful. We must not consider cost or other non-risk factors. The point of the risk evaluation is to really just look at the hazard and exposure of a chemical and make a risk finding. Again, we must include unreasonable risk to potentially exposed or susceptible subpopulations that are determined to be relevant. This process must be completed within 3 to 3.5 years, and for each one completed, EPA must designate a new high priority chemical, and this is the part that keeps that pipeline going. It's kind of a one in, one out. So the diagram here is our risk evaluation process and timeline. Lots of boxes. I'm going to start up in the top left-hand corner. You'll see the word prioritization. So again, that's prioritization process. Those that are identified as high priority, next box down, move directly into our risk evaluation process. So that's the big blue box that spans the length of the slide. Across the top, you'll also see the first 10 chemicals. So upon passage of the law, by that December, so December of 2016, EPA had to designate the first 10 chemicals to enter this process. These were not prioritized. These were chosen by the administrator at that time to begin risk evaluation immediately. So that was a one-off set of chemicals that we are finalizing now. I'll discuss that in a moment, that have gone through the risk evaluation process. And then finally, that second to last box across the top, manufacturer requests. Won't talk too much about this, but manufacturers can request that EPA conduct a risk evaluation on a chemical that they manufacture. This comes with a fee, but it circumvents that prioritization process, and manufacturers can get the risk finding for their chemical. Once in the process, it's treated the exact same way as the EPA initiated risk evaluation. There is a great deal of collaboration with other federal agencies. A number of agencies use chemicals such as DoD or NASA, and a number of agencies have similar jurisdictions. So some chemicals are used, for example, in the pharmaceutical processing, and so we work closely with FDA and to better understand some of those processes. So the risk evaluation process, I'm going to talk about the big blue box in the middle, starting on the left. The first part of risk evaluation is scoping. This is mandated under TSCA. So within the first 6 months, we have to publish a draft, take comment, and then publish a final scope of the risk evaluation. This discusses those conditions of use that I mentioned, so the uses for which a chemical is used within the U.S., looking at identifying any hazards, any exposure that we expect to consider, and any of those potentially exposed or susceptible subpopulations that we expect to consider. This really gives the framework, the outline for which the risk evaluation will follow for the next 3 years. We must do a hazard assessment, an exposure assessment. All of that is rolled into a risk characterization, and a draft risk evaluation is published. We must take public comment on that. It is also peer reviewed by a peer review committee set up here at EPA. And it is handled by a different office. It's peer reviewed. We take that peer review report and the public comment and publish a final risk evaluation. The risk evaluation identifies those conditions which present an unreasonable risk and those conditions of use which may present no unreasonable risk to human health and the environment. For those conditions of use for which we find unreasonable risk, we move directly into risk management, and there's a 2 to 4 year deadline to produce a final rule to manage the risks found. I want to tell you where we are in this process right now. So as I mentioned, in December of 2016, we identified the first 10 chemicals to go through this risk evaluation process, and I've listed them here. I want to draw your attention to methylene chloride, which is the top of the right-hand column. Methylene chloride, we just published at the end of June, the final risk evaluation. So this has been, had everything in that blue box up through peer review and public comment, and we have published the final risk evaluation for methylene chloride. We did find unreasonable risk to human health, and so we are immediately moving to address those risks, and our risk managers are already moving to determine the best course of action to mitigate those risks. So for each of these, there were scope documents published in June of 2017. We had a middle step that's only going to be done for these first 10, which is a problem formulation set of documents that refined the scope, not going to exist for any chemicals after these 10. We published the draft risk evaluations in the winter of 2018 through 2019, and we are in the process of finalizing the risk evaluations for the remaining 9. Like I said, we finished methylene chloride, and we expect those to be out before the end of the calendar year. This has been a huge lift for the agency, never having done full risk evaluations on the chemical. As I said, we did risk assessments on prior to TSCA amendments, and generally those were just on 1 or 2 of the conditions of use of some of these chemicals, but doing 10 at a time to this degree has been a massive lift, and feeling very proud of how much we've accomplished over the past few years on this. I also mentioned that we finished prioritization for 20 chemicals, and so the next 20 that went through the prioritization process are now in the scoping phase. We published the draft scopes back in April of this year, and we are working to finalize the final scopes that we intend to publish later this summer. So if you're keeping count, that is 30 chemicals that are going through risk evaluation. We just completed methylene chloride, so we're 29, but we've had a couple manufacturer requests for chemicals, so we're around 31, I think, right now that are currently going through the risk evaluation process, which again is a huge amount of work, but it's very satisfying to finally doing these risk evaluations. So there's one more piece I thought would be interesting to this group, and that is what we've been calling the regulatory nexus. So TSCA is just one of course, the major environmental statutes which it falls under EPA's jurisdiction. Others, of course, include the Clean Air Act, Safe Drinking Water Act, Clean Water Act, and the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. And under TSCA, we believe that it's reasonable that the TSCA risk evaluations are tailored to the chemical, or fit for purpose is a term that we use. And there's other EPA offices that will have expertise and experience in addressing specific environmental media, of course, the Safe Drinking Water Act or the Clean Air Act. And rather than our office attempt to evaluate and regulate the potential exposure from those media under TSCA, from a resource perspective, we think it's more appropriate that those exposures be handled under the jurisdiction of the other environmental statutes administered by the EPA. These other regulatory programs have processes in place to identify chemical substances and potential regulatory measures for which they can employ. So we believe that this coordinated action on the exposure pathways and risks is consistent with the statutory text and legislative history of TSCA. And so where one statute ends and where the next one begins has been a really interesting process for us. And I want to give you an example. Hopefully this is clear. I know that the words are hard to see, but I think I can explain it pretty well. So this is what we term a conceptual model, and this is for a chemical called 1,3-butadiene. This is a chemical that is a colorless gas, and it's used in the manufacture of plastic and rubber. And so this conceptual model on the left are the releases to waste or wastes from industrial commercial uses, going through the exposure pathways in the middle, the exposure routes, the receptors, and then the hazard. So again, looking at those uses, how they get into the environment, what the route of exposure is it oral, dermal, the receptors, or is it aquatic species, people, terrestrial species, and then what is the hazard associated with that? And so what the boxes represent, the blue box and then the kind of pinkish box below, is where the Safe Drinking Water Act in blue and the Clean Air Act overlap our model for the release of this particular chemical. So 1,3-butadiene is on the candidate or the contaminant candidate list of the Safe Drinking Water Act, and it's also a hazardous air pollutant under the Clean Air Act. And so these two statutes already have jurisdiction and some regulations in place to regulate the exposure of this chemical. And so what TSCA does is work around these existing statutes and associated regulations. So this has been a really interesting process. All 20 of those 20 chemicals have a model like this that you can find in our scope documents on the web. Obviously, some will have no existing regulation, and that's where, of course, TSCA will step in. But some, as you can see here, are relatively regulated already. So final step in our pipeline, of course, is risk management. So when we determine whether a chemical substance under the conditions of use presents an unreasonable risk, those conditions of use are moved directly to risk management, and we must eliminate any unreasonable risk. TSCA Section 6A gives us a suite of the regulatory options. These are listed right from the statute, but it ranges from anything from prohibiting or limiting, restricting the manufacture or processing, restricting a particular use of a chemical, requiring warnings or instructions, requiring record keeping, monitoring, or testing, prohibiting a manner or method for commercial use, or regulating disposal. And so there's a range of different options and that we intend to employ. I will say that we have imposed some proposed regulations on those chemicals that I identified as persistent, bioaccumulative, and toxic. We are finalizing those rules, but I think those rules give a really good snapshot of the range of different regulatory options that we are thinking about. And so we will continue to look at these and speak with manufacturers. It's really a process for which we seek a lot of outreach from stakeholders to see what's going to work best, both protecting the environment and population and from an economic perspective. So that was the whirlwind tour of our existing chemicals program. I'm glad there's time for questions at the end. I know that was a great deal of material. But at this point, I'm going to hand it back to Ryan and to talk about our new chemicals program.
Thanks, Dr. Blair. So I'll now switch gears, and as she mentioned, I'll provide just a brief overview of the TSCA New Chemicals Program, which serves a very different purpose than the existing chemicals program that Dr. Blair just discussed. So in short, the program is designed to ensure that prior to new chemicals entering the marketplace, they do not present an unreasonable risk to human health or the environment. Anyone who plans to manufacture, including import, a new chemical substance, and again, that's one that is not on the TSCA inventory, must first provide EPA with a notice. It's called a pre-manufacturer notice, or PMN. EPA must then review that notice, make a determination, and where appropriate, impose certain risk mitigation measures, testing requirements before those chemicals can enter the market. Unlike the existing chemical risk evaluations, which are lengthy multi-year efforts, EPA's review of new chemical substances must be completed within 90 days of receiving that notice. And there's a potential to extend that review for an additional 90 days under certain circumstances. Submitters are also allowed to request a voluntary suspension of the review process, and they often do so in order to provide us with additional information to inform our review or to mitigate any risks that we may have preliminarily identified during the review process. If risks are identified through the review of a new chemical substance, EPA is then required to impose restrictions or prohibitions on the manufacturing processing of that chemical in order to mitigate those risks. Next slide, please. Following the 2016 amendments, there were a few key changes that I wanted to highlight here to the new chemicals program. One of the more fundamental changes was that EPA is now required to make an affirmative determination before the new chemical can enter the market. Under the original law, if EPA did not take regulatory action on a new chemical notice and the review period simply expired, the submitter could commence manufacture. And historically, around 80% of our new chemical submissions were dropped from review in this manner. Under the new law, EPA must now make one of 5 determinations that I'll describe in the next slide. But a submitter cannot begin manufacturing until that determination has been made, even if the review period has expired. Instead, they may be entitled to a refund of the fee that they paid for us to review that submission. So a second area of significant change is the requirement that both new and existing chemicals be assessed under their conditions of use. Susanna talked a little bit about this. Conditions of use is a new statutory term. It's defined in TSCA as the intended, known, and reasonably foreseen circumstances of manufacture, processing, distribution, and commerce, use, and disposal. And in the context of new chemical submissions, EPA views the information that's provided by the submitter to be the intended conditions of use. So that includes not just the intended use of the new chemical substance itself, but also those other intended elements surrounding the manufacturing process and beyond. But the law now requires EPA to consider any reasonably foreseen conditions of use, and where those are identified, to include them as part of our analysis and determination. Where EPA lacks information to fully assess reasonably foreseen conditions of use, our approach has been to consider whether issuing a significant new use rule might be appropriate. So in short, requiring an additional notice and EPA review prior to any reasonably foreseen condition of use occurring. We have a more detailed explanation of this approach in our working approach document, which is available on our website if you'd like a deeper dive. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned earlier, the 2016 amendments now require EPA to make that affirmative determination on new chemical submissions. And this slide lists those 5 possible determinations. If you read through, you can see there's a range of possibilities, anywhere from a determination that the chemical presents an unreasonable risk of injury to health or the environment, that it may present an unreasonable risk, or that it is not likely to present an unreasonable risk. In addition, there's an available determination that the information is insufficient for EPA to complete its assessment. And there's also a determination that is purely exposure-based, where the chemical may be produced at high volumes, may result in substantial environmental or human exposure. Notably, all of these determinations result in some type of regulatory action by EPA. It could be an order, it could be testing requirements, it could be a rule. The only determination that does not result in regulatory action is a finding that the chemical is not likely to present an unreasonable risk. Next slide, please. So lastly, I wanted to provide just some quick highlights on new provisions in TSCA that are related to confidential business information, or CBI. This area is covered in Section 14 of the law and applies to both the new and existing chemicals program. For those who might not be familiar with CBI, EPA is generally prohibited from publicly disclosing information that meets the criteria. So you may have come across information, perhaps in our public dockets, that has been redacted or partially redacted. It's likely that those redactions reflect TSCA CBI claims. And there were a number of amendments in 2016 that I just wanted to mention that were aimed at ensuring that CBI claims are both robust and warranted, and providing greater public access to critical chemical information. One of those important changes was a new requirement for companies to substantiate their CBI claims and for EPA to review those claims on a set time frame. EPA is now required to review 100% of all CBI claims for chemical identity and 25% of all other claims within a 90-day period. These changes should help reduce overclaiming of CBI and over redactions where CBI protections are not warranted, and in turn enable more information on chemicals to be shared with the public. There were a number of other requirements in the law, including ones that EPA create a system for assigning a unique identifier when there's a CBI claim for the chemical identity itself. There was a requirement that we publish guidance on how to assign generic names for chemicals. We published both of those guidances around 2 years ago, back in June of 2018. But I thought perhaps most relevant for this group is EPA's new authority to share TSCA CBI with state, tribal, and local governments, health and environmental professionals, and emergency personnel under certain specific circumstances. And we also published 3 separate guidance documents on how to request access to TSCA CBI for these different groups. One for the state, tribal, and local governments, one for the environmental, health, and medical professionals, and one for emergency responders. And interestingly, it's my understanding that we have not yet to date received any requests to access TSCA CBI under these new provisions. But hopefully the folks on this call are aware of the option, and I know we have expert staff in our offices who stand ready to assist with any questions you might have on that process and the safeguards that need to be in place in order to make these kinds of requests should you ever find yourself in that need. Next slide, please. So this last slide just includes some links to key parts of our website. We would encourage everyone to explore these links. They do contain a wealth of important information, and we update them fairly regularly. And so with that, I know that, again, that was an awful lot of information to digest on TSCA all at once. But we do, again, appreciate the invite for this event, and we appreciate your attention today. And I think at this point, we're happy to take some questions.
All right, excellent. Thank you both. I am so impressed with how much information you covered there in about 45 minutes. That's really great. So we do have several questions here. Feel free to continue sending them in as we go through some of the Q&A here. So I'll start maybe here in reviewing the PBT, the persistent bioaccumulative and toxic criteria for a substance. Do all 3 of the criteria need to be met for, this says for prioritization, I assume for high prioritization, or would any one aspect, for example, just persistence, be used to prioritize the chemical for review?
Hi, thanks so much for the questions. So those are things that the list of bioaccumulative and cancer and the proximity to drinking water, those are criteria with which we use to screen the chemical, but it ultimately comes down to the definition of high priority. And so that's going back to the idea, does it have potential hazard and potential exposure? And so just looking at persistence, as you mentioned, could yes, cause it to have a potential hazard, and so it would, just having one of those criteria could definitely make it a high priority chemical, and so it doesn't matter if it's just one criteria that kind of flips it into the potential hazard category, and so yes, it could. I think the answer to your question is yes.
Thanks, Susanna. Yeah. And another question here, we didn't really touch on this in the slides, I don't believe. Could you talk a little bit about how enforcement is achieved? This question was, you can talk about it broadly. This specific question is, when reviewing uses of a chemical within the US, is there consideration for restricting imported materials that would otherwise be restricted for use inside the United States for the TSCA review process? And in general, how is enforcement achieved? So I'll turn it back over.
I can take a shot at that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, thank you, Erica, for the question. And if I'm understanding it right, one thing to keep in mind is that TSCA actually defines manufacturer to include import. So all of the safeguards that we have in place and the review processes for considering whether or not manufacture of a chemical, whether that be an existing chemical or a new chemical, whether or not the manufacturing presents any type of unreasonable risk, built into those considerations are considerations for imported materials. So I don't know if that helps or if I'm missing some aspect of that question. Happy to clarify.
Yeah. Erica, if that didn't answer, just feel free to shoot in another question there. There's several questions in the box related to, oh, she says, yes, it helps. Okay, great. There's several questions in here related to what Dr. Blair referred to as the regulatory nexus. And there's one from Sophie here that I really liked. She says, for 1,3-butadiene, Dr. Blair indicated that there are regulations in place to control exposure via drinking water. However, this compound is not regulated under the Safe Drinking Water Act. It's on the CCL, and there are over 100 compounds on that list, most of which are not addressed during the regulatory determination cycle, which occurs every 5 years. So what's the basis for suggesting that the CCL compounds have controlled exposure via drinking water?
Great question. I didn't mean to imply that this was easy. Part of the reason I included it is that it is quite challenging to figure out, like I said, where one statute ends and where the next one begins. Absolutely, it is a CCL and it is on the CCL and it is not yet regulated through that mechanism. And one of the things that we intend to do is look when we are evaluating that chemical, if there is if we do find a risk, we can, under Section 9 of TSCA, recommend that a particular use be regulated under a different regulatory statute. We can refer it to the Office of Water, we can refer it to the Office of Air, we can actually refer to another agency to look at that and evaluate it and regulate it under their purview. And so you're absolutely right. And that's something that we have ongoing conversations with the Office of Water on some of the first 10. We're looking at that with 1,4-dioxane. I think it's also mentioned in the question. 1,4-dioxane is exactly the same. And so we are now finalizing some work with the Office of Water of the best way to move forward in addressing any potential risk with those chemicals.
Okay, great. And we have a very specific question coming here. What can you tell us about the research on the short chain C6 PFAS and what's going on under TSCA on those chemicals?
Ryan, you want to take PFAS?
Sure. So I can't speak specifically to research per se that's going on short chain PFAS chemicals. I would point out that the agency does have a fairly comprehensive PFAS action plan that was published. It's available on our website, and it describes what we as an agency are doing on PFAS substances broadly. I can speak to what our office is doing on PFAS if that's of interest, and it's mainly in the in two areas. So one is in our new chemicals program. We continue to get applications in for PFAS substances that replace some of those more antiquated longer chain PFAS substances, and we review those new PFAS substances and ensure that prior to going to market that any unreasonable risks have been mitigated. The other thing that our office has been working on is a significant new use rule, which applies to the long chain PFAS, and ensuring that prior to any of the former uses of long chain PFAS substances, could ever come back into the market, that they first have to go through that robust review and determination process, again, in our new chemicals program. Suzanne, I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to add.
I was just, there's a great deal of work also ongoing with our Office of Research and Development as it pertains to both the short and the long chain, and that might be a good resource.
Yeah, thank you. And PFAS is such a hot topic for drinking water administrators and the sector at large. We did have a question here. Maybe you could speak to it a little bit more about how the chemical companies and manufacturers that are using PFAS compounds and possibly releasing them into the environment, how do they inform EPA of their production around those?
Well, this is Ryan again. I'm searching for the question. I didn't quite catch the beginning of it, but I think you said novel PFAS substances, which again, those would be PFAS substances that are new. They're not on our TSCA inventory, and so they would go through the new chemicals program process that I described. So before they could be manufactured, the company would have to submit a notice to our office, and we would go through the review and the determination, and where appropriate, any sort of risk management. And through that process, they would provide us with information on what they intend in terms of production volume and other aspects of their intended process.
Okay, great. So sorry, my audio cut out during that. Ryan, did you finish your answer to that question? I didn't catch it, but hopefully it was good.
I think so. If I understood the question right, it was about novel PFAS substances and how we would keep an eye on those. And again, they do go through our new chemicals review and determination process.
Okay, great. We have a question here too about process for under the new chemicals and for new substances. What happens to the review process if EPA doesn't meet the 90-day initial review timeline, and are those extensions requested, or if not, what would the implications be?
Yeah, it's a good question. So the 90 days is, again, it's a review period that's mandated by statute. We have the authority to extend for that additional 90 days, and then also, as I mentioned, a regulatory provision that allows submitters to voluntarily suspend the review period while they work with us. And in practice, we do get a lot of those suspensions. So the new chemicals review process is fairly iterative. We have a lot of back and forth with submitters. They provide us with information, and we provide feedback, and they may provide additional information. And a lot of times we're working together to both make sure that we completely understand both the intended conditions of use that are associated with that substance and the potential health and environmental risks. So it's an iterative process. Oftentimes we get those requests for suspension of the review period so that we keep within the 90-day time frame.
Okay, great. And here's a great question too. While years have gone into the evaluation of the 10 existing chemicals from 2016 to 2020, that initial set of 10, is EPA able to keep up with the pace of introduction of new chemicals and these timeframes set by TSCA?
So the new chemicals program and the existing are fairly separate. We have different teams that work on the different work products. It is a lot of work. It's a great deal of work, and as I mentioned, it's more than we've ever done before The agency has hired a good number of people based on the amount of work that we're doing. We are doing our level best to keep up in the existing chemicals program, and we've hit many or most of the statutory timelines that have been imposed, and we continue to push ahead as required. And the new chemicals program, again, is a separate entity, and I think there's a number of facts and figures on our website as to how we're keeping up with the new chemical PMNs, or the pre-manufacturer notices.
Yeah, reading through all that EPA is required to do, it's some really fast-paced stuff there. So kudos to you guys for being a part of that. To build on the question about the novel PFAS and the reporting under the new chemicals program, is this the sort of information that the state and local governments could acquire through the CBI provisions?
Yeah, this is Ryan. Yes, absolutely. There are some requirements that need to be met before EPA is authorized to share CBI with states, but those provisions for sharing the information span the entire TSCA program. So whether it's a new chemical substance or an existing chemical substance, the authority is there for us to share. And as I mentioned, we've published guidance to help states and local governments understand what they need to do to make those requests and understand the circumstances under which they would qualify to receive that confidential information.
Okay, great. I mean, we do still have a few questions coming in here. Let's see. Sorry, just trying to make sure I'm not repeating any questions. I think there's a lot of interest in how TSCA works with the Safe Drinking Water Act and how the Safe Drinking Water Act rule development fits into the prioritization process for these chemicals. And, it sounds like, Susanna, when you were going through the existing chemicals, there's several points at which, and Ryan too on the new chemicals, there's several points at which drinking water administrators or states or other interested stakeholders could interface with the process. Could you maybe talk about the points of public interaction? I know there's SNRs that go out for comment, the risk evaluation, the prioritization piece, does that also have opportunity for input from stakeholders? And can you maybe talk a little bit about that process?
Absolutely, that's a really important piece of this. TSCA did afford, in the existing chemicals program particularly, a number of opportunities for public input. I should preface all this to say that you don't only have to provide input when there are open public comment periods. We are open and willing to receive comment anytime. But in terms of public comment periods, the prioritization process, once we initiate prioritization, the first step is to identify a candidate chemical that is going through the process. And following that, there's a public comment period for anyone to provide any information that might inform both prioritization or risk evaluation if folks believe that it's a high priority chemical. Following that 90-day comment period, we will put out a proposed designation. So we will propose whether a chemical is high or low. And then there's a second 90-day public comment period, allowing the public to comment on what we've proposed and the information that we've used to make that proposed designation. So that's prioritization. And then in the risk evaluation process, there is a public comment period after the draft scope. Scope, again, being what we intend to consider in the risk evaluation, those conditions of use, hazard, potentially exposed susceptible subpopulations, exposure, routes, pathways. There's a comment period after that. And then after the publication of the draft risk evaluation, there is another public comment period. So in the course of 4 years, there's 4 public comment periods. Prior to the first prioritization process, we did open dockets to receive any public input of chemicals that the public would like to see us prioritize. And we did get some feedback there. And I think that as we move forward, that become more and more important. We are working with a number of the offices within EPA, the water office included, to identify or look to identify the next kind of group of candidates for prioritization, those chemicals that might move through. Again, when we're finished this clump of 20, there will be a following group of 20. And so I think this will be a very public process, and we encourage folks to participate in all of this.
Yeah, and that sounded like it was mostly focused on the existing chemicals, Susanna.
Yes.
Okay, yeah. Any additions on the new chemicals process and how folks on this call might be able to get involved, Ryan?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I would just echo what Susanna said in terms of, our door is always open, or our email inboxes as well. So we welcome and encourage stakeholders to reach out to us with ideas for how we can improve, or questions that we can help to answer. The statutory and regulatory options for public comment are not as rigorous for new chemicals as they are for existing chemicals, and that's in part driven by the fact that the review period, the 90-day timeline, is often so short. We have in the past had a number of public meetings on new chemicals where we welcomed input from stakeholders on various issues. We released, I mentioned, a document called our Working Approach to Making Determinations on New Chemicals, and we took public comment on that. And on our regulatory agenda, we also are in the early stages of a rulemaking to consider changes to new chemical procedures more broadly. So moving forward, that rulemaking effort will provide another opportunity for folks to weigh in.
Great, thanks. Here's a follow-up to the CBI conversation we were having. Can you talk about maybe what kind of information would be considered confidential business information? And this question has how to request access, but it sounds like that request process is detailed in the guidance, and maybe where they can access the guidance.
Sure. I mean, I'm happy to send a link around to you, Wendy, or whatever makes most sense, so that folks on the call can have a direct link to the guidance on our website. I think if you would just Google sharing CBI with states, EPA sharing CBI with states, you might be one of the first things that pops up. But in terms of what kind of information, I mean, the companies can claim confidentiality for a broad range of information. So it might be that they claim CBI for the location of a particular manufacturing or processing site. So in a document that might be publicly available on that particular chemical, it might have the location of the facility, the name or the address claimed as confidential. And if that information is important for states or local governments or emergency responders or others, and they otherwise meet those requirements, both in TSCA and as are detailed in our guidance, they would be able to request that EPA nonetheless share that information that is otherwise confidential and not shared with the public.
Okay, great. We also have a question here about emailing the presentations to the attendees. So after this webinar, we will work to convert it to a recording and get that posted to the ASDWA website. But as a part of that too, we can send out, assuming that Susanna and Ryan, we haven't talked about this, but assuming you're okay with me sharing your slides with the folks who attended, we will have a link to that as well available, and that'll go out to all the attendees of today's webinar, so you can have access to those slides. Okay. Okay, yeah, so some interesting questions coming in through here. I know this is kind of interesting, but the there's one question here about how the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act and the Safe Drinking Water Act all regulate exposure but not production. And Susanna, you may have covered this, but maybe we could just go over it again. The ways in which TSCA can, under that risk management or mitigation phase, some of the outcomes of potential risk management under TSCA, I think it leads all the way up to basically banning the chemical, but there are several steps before you get to like an outright ban on production, correct?
Yes, that is absolutely correct. And it's important to mention that we do this per condition of use. And so as Ryan showed, conditions of use is really cradle to grave, and all the uses in between. And so that we can impose a regulation on the manufacturing, on the distribution, on the disposal, using any range of regulatory means. So we can put limits on the distribution. I think one of the ones that we proposed in the past was limiting or defining what size vessel a certain chemical can be transported in, where it can be sold. There's a lot of history with methylene chloride in the past couple of years on this. And so there's a range of things, and all of those range of things apply to the range of uses that we have looked at.
Okay, great. Well, I'm kind of scrolling through all of our questions here. I think we've answered most of them. And I certainly don't mind ending a few minutes early to let everybody transition to the next thing they've got going on. So, you know, any final statements from our presenters? It was really great to have you on today.
Just a thanks. Thanks for the invitation. Thanks for listening. We know it's a huge amount of material and maybe not something that you all deal with on the day-to-day. And I'm excited for you all for your next TSCA webinar. It will be interesting to foil our information that we've provided with who you're going to hear from in the next few webinars. I think that TSCA is deep and complicated. A lot of science policy issues come to light, and it's you know, from the nerdy perspective, it's really a fascinating place to be. It's so rare that you're at the forefront of a new law being implemented and all the twists and turns that takes. So we hope we've provided a flavor for you all, but it's been a real pleasure to speak with you.
Yeah, well said. All right, well, with that, we'll go ahead and end. Thanks again to our presenters. We're getting lots of love in the chat and the Q&A, so thank you for your time. And as Anthony said there in the chat, we'll send an email out next week with a link to the recordings and the slides, and we might include some of these links that you see here just for ease of access and to the CBI guidance and some of the other things. So thanks so much, and we'll go ahead and end the recording. Enjoy your Friday and your weekend.